Converted man here?
It's the converted man.
Converted man here. Welcome again to the end of atheism. And now we're going to do, why does God allow suffering and pain? I already did that, but we're going to do it again because this is part 2, an evolutionary perspective. Now surely the Muslim apologists don't have anything against evolution, right? Here we go!
In our last video, we looked at why suffering is needed for our own moral and spiritual development. But when we ponder over suffering on a deeper level, we realize that it is necessary for the development of all types of life, be it our own personal journeys or the journey of humanity itself. After all, so many of our advances have come out of a desire to take away suffering. Be it advances in medicine or technology, without suffering, there would be no progress.
Wouldn't a world without pain and suffering be one that we could learn just as much in, if not more, than we do? Yeah, you can say that necessity is the mother of invention. Are they going to say that in this video? They're going to say that in this video later. But just because we didn't have pain and suffering doesn't mean that we wouldn't be driven to explore or understand things. Even with a benevolent God constantly watching over us and making sure that we never got hurt or never suffered, or if we did, that we'd be immediately healed from the pain or injury or what have you. And if we all absolutely knew God was there because he was right there in front of us, like in the sky or something all the time, we could just look in there and be like, hey, how's it going? Hey, how's it going? All right. You know, it's another fine day to walk in the middle of the road knowing I can't get hurt. Okay. Well, that road would take some invention to make it. We would still have some sort of drive to create things and explore things if God still gave us that desire. Which, if there is a God, it must have then given us the desire to explore and understand things. So, the need for discovery and invention and technology wouldn't just vanish without pain and suffering. God could easily set up a system where there's no pain and suffering, and the drive to find different ways to deal with different ideas, different problems, different things would still exist. You show a guy in a wheelchair as if this is an example of something that has forced us to forward progress. Okay, sure, we need ramps now for the wheelchair. In fact, we need to invent the wheelchair. We also need to invent drugs, and we need to invent some sort of way to work at the spine to fix the spine. And we need to use stem cells, which is something that many of the super mega religious are against because they are afraid of either playing God or they're worried that it's coming from unborn babies or what have you. Some of them are, some of them aren't, whatever. But nonetheless, research and development in that wouldn't be necessary if people in wheelchairs didn't exist. If everybody was able to walk and never had that problem, there'd be no need for these things. And why would that be bad? Why would not needing those things or not having those things be bad? Those technologies wouldn't be necessary. What's the problem? And if God wanted those technologies to be a thing, then couldn't God just give us a reason to make those things on our own that wasn't that? It's almost like you're grasping at straws or something.
But this doesn't just apply today. Let's take a trip down the history of mankind to the era of the caveman. Imagine that all our prehistoric forefathers had all their wishes granted, and all their difficulties resolved. Would we not still be cavemen?
Wait a minute. Are you telling me that this Muslim apologetic thing is okay with biological evolution? I I don't know what to say. I'm dumbfounded.
What need would we have for fire if we were never cold? If we were never tired or bored from travelling, then why bother inventing the wheel? But why stop there? If we really want to remove suffering from our world, we should try and do it as soon as possible, right at the beginning, at the very first step of evolution, the time of the amoeba.
Well, that's not really the beginning of evolution, but it's kind of close. Not really, but it's good. I mean, granted, it's not the first stage, but at least they're trying. So we gotta give them props for trying, right? We don't want to give them props, but we should. This is good. Yay! They're on board with evolution, even though in the other video they totally seem to be against it, but that's okay. They're okay with it in this video. So if the amoeba doesn't have suffering, then it wouldn't evolve. Okay. And? So what? We'd all be amoebas. What's the problem? Why would that matter? I don't know. I don't have an answer for that. Maybe they do. I doubt it, but let's find out.
Imagine what little suffering our unicellular ancestors were dimly aware of was taken away. No amoeba could be allowed to outcompete other organisms for resources, for that would involve suffering. No change in the environment could occur, for that could cause suffering. Thus, in our unicellular atheistic utopia, there could be no struggle, no survival, and no improved fitness.
Not about fitness, it's about adaptation to the environment that you're in. And yes, we would never have adapted to be the present state that we're in. We would have just stayed that state without any need to change that state at all. So what? What's the problem?
The same problem would apply wherever we seek to end suffering in the history of evolution. Wherever we try, there and then would the wheel of evolution grind to a crashing halt. So it seems that our atheist friends would have us surrender our very lives to rid us of suffering.
If we were to go way back when and make it so that amoebas didn't have pain and suffering, so they didn't have to compete for food and or couldn't compete for food, the environment didn't change, so we'd have a group of organisms that continually reproduce and never really adapted because the environment would be completely suitable for them. Although they might still adapt because random mutations might force that, but if random mutations cause suffering, then we're not going to allow that either somehow. So you, as we know it, would never exist. It's not about giving up your life, it's just you wouldn't exist in the first place. Which I guess is kind of giving up your life, but it's the wrong way to think about that, because you're talking about time travel and changing the past and how things would have been really different had there not been suffering. But what you're saying is, in essence, God uses suffering to promote evolution. So without suffering, we wouldn't have evolved. So clearly then, suffering is absolutely necessary for evolution to take place. Why not just say that? Say, yeah, evolution's true, and the reason that suffering exists is so that God could get us to where we are today. There you go. There's an answer for why suffering exists. Nothing to do with free will. Nothing to do with finding God. It's just, it had to be that way. Although God could have done it a different way, but God didn't because of reasons that we're not going to explain. Also, let's try to compare and contrast and conflate evolution and atheism into one thing, because that's a thing that we do when we're apologetics.
But whether they realize it or not, what they are truly objecting to is our consciousness, our awareness of losses and gains, which translate into pain and pleasure. Take away that awareness of pain, and we would have no means to experience pleasure either. Suffering and happiness are two sides of the same coin.
There are people born without the ability to feel any pain at all. And this is a problem because if they break their toe, they don't know about it. Or if they step on a nail, they could bleed out and never know because they just don't feel pain at all. But nonetheless, they feel no pain and thus no suffering, yet these people can still experience happiness. Oops! That's kind of a problem for your idea, because this counterexample that we find in reality completely shatters your idea, doesn't it? Didn't think about that though, did you? And no, they're not the same side of the same coin. Pain and pleasure are very different functions in the brain chemically and serve very different functions biologically speaking and physiologically speaking. Pain is typically a response to some sort of exterior or interior stimuli that your body is telling you something is wrong so that you can do something about it. Pleasure is a very different part of the brain, evolved for a very different reason and has different chemicals associated with it. So absolutely you could know pleasure without knowing pain, or you could know pain without knowing pleasure. This false dichotomy just completely and utterly is, well, false. What do we call it when something's completely a lie? Oh, wait. Go on with the video!
Now, to understand this better, we only have to look at the example of parenthood. For many, the loss of a child is the worst thing that can ever happen to them. But that's only because having a child brings them such indescribable joy. The only way to remove suffering would be by giving up consciousness itself, or by never having anything to lose.
No, you don't have to get rid of consciousness because, as I said, pain and pleasure are different parts of the brain controlled by different chemicals, and you don't understand what consciousness is, and you're conflating consciousness with emotions, which I guess is understandable if you don't really understand the biology of how our brains work. It's a complicated subject. I'm not going to say that I understand it that well, but I at least know that pain and suffering are two different things inside the brain. You can have one but not the other. You could have neither, or you could have both, or whatever. As far as never have anything to lose, yeah, I guess. I mean, if you never had anything to gain or to lose, then you might not know what anything is at all unless there was something to know anything about. But, again, I'm pretty sure that God could have figured out a better system than what we have. But hey, who am I to question the system that God set up? Again, you're not really explaining away suffering. You're just saying that it exists. And you're saying that in a way that it's necessary for evolution. And you've made an outright lie here by saying that we have to have suffering to know pleasure. You don't. That's absolutely false. Or that if you never had anything, then you wouldn't know what it is to lose anything. Well, okay, that's trivially true, but then why not make us in that state? Because that would be a better state than the state that we have. But I am sure that God could have made a different and better system than what we have. Now, if God does exist, it means that God didn't do that for whatever reason. But it's not for the reasons that you're saying, because the reasons you're saying don't have any logically coherentness to them. Is that even a word, coherentness? It's a word now.
We see then that the existence of suffering is not only compatible with a benevolent God, but compulsory.
When did we see that? No, we didn't see that. How? Why? When? No, you didn't show us that at all.
It plays an indispensable role in our spiritual, moral, and physical evolution. Remove the capacity to suffer, and every aspect of life wilts like a dying flower. Permit it, and watch as life flourishes towards its true potential. As Mirza Tahir Ahmed wrote, it is beyond the reach of human compassion to efface suffering without effacing life itself.
Hey, remember in the first video when they said that this was for everybody that believes in God, yet now twice we've had a clearly Muslim quote from a clearly Muslim person? But it's for everybody! Anyway, so just pointing out that they're not being honest about why they've made this series. This is Muslim apologetics, even though they're trying to wrap it in the idea that we're all on the same side if we believe in God. We've had numerous logical fallacies throughout their videos, and we've had, I would submit, a very bad argument for their theism. Their God is one that is still ignoring suffering. They didn't make the case, as I submit they should have made, which is that God has to allow for suffering in order for evolution to take place. And the reason why is an unknown. We don't know why. We can't explain it. That's just the way it is. Maybe God had no choice. But that would hurt their theology. That would hurt their doctrines. So they can't make that argument, and they didn't make that argument. Instead, they make this weird argument. It's like, well, if you were to remove pain and suffering, then none of this would be here. But why can't God just pop us into existence, like some people said that God has done that? So, what is it? Is it that God forces evolution by suffering, or it doesn't? The argument falls apart because there isn't even an argument being made. And so beyond the logical fallacies and beyond the wrongness of this whole series, and beyond the fact that at no point did they ever end atheism, because the only way to end that is to prove a God exists in the way that atheists and skeptics have classically and repeatedly demanded for centuries. Empirical evidence, repeatable tests, and or a logically coherent argument, and we have none of that. And unless and until we do, we have to stay skeptical of the conclusions.
The sword figure from
Blah! Get to the
Mars.
chopper!
Mars. Remember you on Mars?
Get to Mars! I'm Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Sorry.
I'm dying. Okay. Oh, get to the chopper. Okay, I don't. That's okay.